Okay, chapter 18 of The Devil of Massachusetts. 8 Fire Bands of Hell. The wheels of justice now turn at full speed. On 9 September, the judges tried to condemn 6 witches, and on 17 September, 9 more. For a total of 15, 8 were hanged on 22 September. All but one of the 7 who escaped hanging could be judicially accounted for. 5 were confessing witches: Rebecca Ems of Boxford, Abigail Hobbs of Topsfield, Mary Lacey and Ann Foster of Andover, Dorcas Har of Beverly. These were condemned but reprieved. Francis Dane's daughter, Abigail Flonker, got a stay of execution by pleading pregnancy. Only with seven, Only with the 7th was there any irregularity. Mary Broadbury of Salisbury, escaped and is escaped, or if escaped is too strong a word, she, being too feeble to do anything for herself, at least her friends had some obscure way managed to hide her from authority, and authority, it was suspected, was taking no very positive action to arrest itself. Mary Broadbury was one of the best loved members of her community. A 93 neighbor had signed a statement in half a century they had never known her to make trouble. Robert Pike and the revered James Allen testified to her charity and piety. Her husband Thomas, to whom she had been married 50 years and had borne 11 children, said that she was of a cheerful spirit, liberal, and charitable, but now that she was old, weak, and grieved under her affliction, may not be able to speak much of herself, not being so free of speech as others may be. Such testimony came from the circle of Miss Broadbury's affectionate acquaintance. Not everyone in Salisbury belonged to it. At the outer edges, there were people who looked at the view of that her seeming goodness was a false front behind which she concealed abominations. The elder, a 93-year-old woman, wow. The elder, Anne Putnam, having lived in Salisbury in youth, and not having moved in Mrs. Bradbury's social set, knew all about the abominations. Her kinsman Richard Carr had as good as seen the woman herself turn into a blue boar away. Anyway, he saw that the boar rushed out of the gate which Miss Bradbury had just entered, and dashed at the feet of his father's horse. Neither he nor other witnesses doubted that the boar was Miss Bradbury. Apparently neither did judges or jury when the story was duly relayed to them. The women even haunted ships at sea. Samuel Endicott had caught her at it. By bad luck, his captain had brought 2 frictions of butter from her, and these had spoiled, not too surprisingly, since the ship was bound for the Barbados and ill equipped with refrigeration. I'm surprised they used that word in this book. The spoiling of the butter was, however, only the beginning of Miss Bradbury's display of malefic powers. Soon after the Barbados, the ship ran into a storm. lost its main mast and sprang a leak, which ruined several tons of salt. At this point, Miss Broadberry, gloating over her accomplishment, had or could not resist the temptation to show off. On a bright moonlit night, Etiquette looked up, and there she sat on the windlass, neat and composed in her white cap and neckcloth, as she had ever been at meeting in Salisbury. There could be no plainer evidence than that Miss Bradbury was sentenced to hang, yet did not. Her friends found means of spiriting her away and concealing her. The success of the concealment and the probability, not ungrounded suspicion, that local magistrates did not overexert themselves to track her down, gave rise to some quarters to discontent. It did not reassure common folk to feel that special privilege existed even among witches. The other kind of special privilege was involved in the case of Dorcas Hoar. The privilege accorded confessing witches. Goody Hoar is the same who had once shouted at the girls, "God will stop the mouths of liars," had been at last minute confessor. She had been tried, sentenced, and her hanging was imminent. Before she confessed at all, it was then too late that she would have gone up to the gallows, regardless, had not influential friends got up a petition for her. Now she was safe, but at least she was reprieved, being given, as a petition put it, a little time of life to realize and protect her repentance for ye salvation of her soul. All this was very well in the course very merciful of judges. Just the same, some people wondered whether the dramatic and 11th hour repentance had been based on the woman's desire to save her soul or just to have her neck. Such doubts occurred sometimes even to John Hale, who had helped initiate the petition. There were moments when the woman's reckless defiance in court seemed to him, in retrospect, more convincing than her present eager acknowledgement of ex- extravagant sins. To be sure, the woman had undoubtedly served an apprenticeship of witchcraft 2 decades ago. She had admitted to borrowing a book of uh, palmistry, and 6 years later, she apparently still had it. Hill's servants kept sneaking over to her house on dubious errands, bearing gifts, uh, pilfered from their master, and this little daughter Rebecca had followed them and seen a book with many streaks and pictures in it. Not at all, not at all improbable that Goody Hoar had gone from such minor sorceries to the real thing. Even so, how probable was it that she would have confessed had she known that they would hang her anyway? There was nothing bloodthirsty about the kind, long suffering John Hill, yet sometimes he secretly wished that the judges would get around to hanging some of these confessors. A murderer was not spared because he confessed. Why then spare a confessing witch? How could the sincerity of all these confessions be tested by the hanging man's rope? The fact was that until now people had been reserved not for those who pleaded guilty, but for those who professed innocence. How could it be that so many whose souls were burdened with such a crime had gone to death without seeking the solace of confession? Had the devil so hardened their hearts that none was capable of repentance, or was it possible that they had nothing to confess? Hell shredded, sorry, Hill stuttered away from the thought, but it kept reoccurring, and not to him alone, nor was it made easier by the fact that two of the former confessors had renounced their confessions. Margaret Jacobs escaped condemnation uh, in the September trials only because she was too ill to be brought into court. Samuel Willard of Andover stood his trial, heard his sentence, and suffered it without once going back to his former story. His confession through his wife and daughter clung to his confession, though his wife and daughter clung to their dear life, clung to theirs for dear life. It was, or what was it that guided Wardwell now? Was the devil, or was it perhaps the angel of God? And if the latter were, who were the sinners and who the murderers? Samuel Wardwell was the only male involved in September trials. The women sentenced on 9 September were Martha Corey of Salem Village, Alice Parker, and Anne uh, Prudiater of Salem Town. Prudiater, I guess that's how you say the name, of Salem Town, and Mary Etsy of Topsfield added to the roster on 17 September, where Margaret Scott and Rowley, Mary Parker of Andover, and Wilmore Red of Marblehead. All Marblehead had known for a lifetime that that Mommy Red, aging wife of a fisherman, was a witch, but until the girls had come along, Marblehead had not been disposed to anything about it. God had suffered the woman's general harmless sorceries, expressed mainly in the curdling of milk and spoiling of water. Why not Marblehead? But Wilmot Red was cried out on and taken, and being a poor, unable to do more than mutter, "I know nothing of it," at the trial had been condemned, and Pudeator, I guess, and Pudeator had struck, or is it Pudiator, and Pudiator, I guess that's how you say that, had struck out at her accusers. She had petitioned that the testimony sworn against her by Sarah Churchill, Mary Warren, John Best be stricken from the record, and as altogether false and untrue, and that my life may not be taken away by such false evidence. But though she remained, the judges that Best had firmly suffered public whipping had, as a proved liar, her defense availed her nothing. Long imprisonment had not quelled the militant self-righteous of Martha Corey, when on 14 September, Paris and the delegation from the village church called on her to tell her that she now lay under the sentence of excommunication. Martha expressed herself very forcefully. Paris did not dignify her words by recording them. He entered in the parish book only the observation that she was very obdurate, very obdurate, justifying herself and condemning all that had done anything to her just discovery and condemnation. Nor did Paris record his own words uh, except to intimate, except to intimidate. No, not intimidate. Except to intimate that they had been few. For her uh, imperiousness would not suffer much. He did manage a prayer, but not at the invitation of Martha. She had done enough of the prayers of men like him. It was well that they had not risked bringing her to church to be excommunicated publicly, as Nicholas Noyes had done with Rebecca Nurse. Martha Corey was not the sort of martyr who suffers in silence. Rebecca Nurse's sister, Mary Etsy, had been fighting for her life all summer. As early as June, when there was hope for saving Rebecca's life as well, she and her third sister, the door slamming Sarah Cloyce, had pleaded that fairer conditions and should prevail at their trials than at their examinations. Since they were allowed no counsel, they asked that you, who are our judges, would please to counsel us, to direct us within wherein we may stand in need. They asked that the testimony of ministers, friends, and their children be admitted, and that the testimony of witches or of as trying to turn the page, such as are afflicted as is supposed by witches, may not be improved to condemn us without legal evidence. The petition asked for nothing that the Council of Ministers had not already recommended, yet it had no effect at all. The judges determined to get on with their work could not afford to be guided by such considerations as these proposed, and in which, if adopted, would have caused the collapse of the whole prosecution. What other legal evidence can you get against a criminal whose malefaction is by definition spectral, but the reports of his victim and criminals who have turned king's evidence? After her condemnation, Mary Etsy made one last appeal, not now of herself, but in behalf of all others who might come to trial as innocent as she. I petition to your honors not for my own life, but for I know I must die, and my appointed time is set, but there no more innocent blood be shed, which undoubtedly cannot be avoided in the way and course you go in. I question not but your honors do the utmost of your pains in the discovery and detection of witchcraft and witches, and would not be guilty of innocent blood for the world, but by my own innocency. I know you are in the wrong way. I humbly beg of you that your honors would be pleased to examine some of the confessing witches. I, being confident there are several of them, have belayed themselves and others. They say myself and others have made a league with the devil. I know, and the Lord he knows, they belie me. They belay me, and so I question not, but they do others. And the Lord alone, who is a searcher of hearts, knows that as I shall answer to to the tribunal seat, I know not the least thing of witchcraft, therefore I trust not belly my soul. The executions were set for Thursday 22 September. Before they could take place, they were preceded on Monday of the week of an unscheduled execution. Gilles Coy, husband of the unrepentant Martha, had been pressed to death by the sheriff on 19 September in an open field beside the jail. Death was probably not the explicit objective of the sheriff's attentions. He was merely applying the English procedure of the uh, penine, uh, peine forte et dure to the criminals so stubborn that he had stood mute, therefore refusing to place himself formally on trial under the common law of the land. In the whole history of English law, very few people placed on trial for felony had had the fortitude to stand mute and endure the penalty expressly designed to discourage such uh, obstinacy. It must have been supposed when the ordeal began that after a certain number of rocks had been placed on Corey's chest, he would break down and consent to giving testimony. But Gilles Corey had endured his only record, his only recorded, his only recorded utterance, and it it is tradition with records, it being an occasional gasp more weight. So all he ever said was more weight. Uh, Gilles had come a long way since that day in March when he had offered his fumbling testimony against his wife to the magistrates. His testimony had seemed mere stupidity, being little more than an expression of wonder that his wife should linger by the fire to pray long after he expected her in bed. It appeared stupid, however, only in contrast to the live lyre offerings of the girls. The old man, credulous as he was as to uh, as to the cause of their affliction, had stubbornly kept to the facts as he knew them, and in fact will often show poor and plain in contrast to leapings of imagination. At his own examination, he had still been credulous and humble. I am a poor man and cannot help it, but the examination and the long months in prison that followed it had slowly opened his eyes. He knew himself to be innocent, and yet the girls had accused him of just such pranks as she had believed against his wife. Now he saw that he had broken charity with Martha in believing the word of a pack of lying girls against her. By his own innocence, his reasoning paralleled that of Marietzi. He knew that his wife was innocent as well. While he lay in jail turning over these things in his slow mind, the trials went on, and it bore upon Gilles, as upon every witch accused, that there was hope for nothing from the trial but of further injury to one's good name. When his turn came, he stood speechless before the judges. He would not plead, he would not testify before such a court. Better the breaking of his bones one by one than the mockery that the she brats would heap on him if he opened his mouth. Sent back to prison to await execution of judgment, he undertook an experiment. Except in cases of treason, conviction could not be obtained on a prisoner who stood mute, and without conviction, his property could not be confiscated. Accordingly, Gillis deeded his land to those of his son-in-law who had refused to believe the charges of witchcraft against Martha, even when he himself had done so. So it was that though the sheriff slowly crushed the last breath out of the massive body, he could not make a condemned wizard out of old Gillis or lift a finger to prevent the property from going to his heirs, for the deeds held. So, on no grounds did they have to do what they did to him, but they did it anyway. Because he said nothing, and they killed him anyway. His death in an open field did not go unwitnessed, though there were some who indulged their bloodlust in the sight, others who found reassurance in the righteous sovereignty of the judgment. There were still others who wondered if this were justice at all. There had been a kind of sublime obstinacy in the old man. There was a meaning in his death, a symbolism which they could define and by same token could not stop talking about. It was a relief to Samuel Sewall, most conscious of judgment and not at all immune to by nature to considerations of mercy, to get a letter on the subject from Thomas Putnam, father of the gifted Anne. Guileless, he thereby learned, had not been the only sufferer. During the whole Monday, while so many in town had given way to false pity for the deserved fate of a foul old man, an innocent maid had lain in torture just as painful, exactly as the rocks had been laid on Guileless' chest. A whole convocation of witches had closed in on poor Anne to crush her chest, choke the breath out of her body, and mock her, saying that she should pass to death before Guileless. But God's grace, there came release, and was saved by the apparition of his winding sheet, who, having driven off the witches, explained to her why Guileless had to be pressed to death, of a fate concerning which Anne herself seemed to have had some briefly conscious compunctions. Guileless, she now learned, had once pressed a man to death with his feet, the very man whose ghost was now with her. Guileless had also at one time of his covenant with the devil driven a spectral bargain. The devil had promised that he should not hang. So it was, and God had expressly hardened his heart against the advice of the court, which would have arranged an easier death, because the apparition said, "It must be done to him as he has done to me." Putnam, hearing this testimony, recalled an incident which had been forgotten during the prosecution of Guileless. 17 years ago, long before Anne had been born, Guileless had been held into court to account for the death of a man living in his house who had been found bruised to death and having cauldrons of blood around his heart. Gallus had somehow got clear of the charge of murder by enchantment. Putnam now realized by God's providence he had now undergone the punishment he had inflicted on an innocent man, and the truth had been revealed out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, and anyhow of young Anne, who could probably have known of the event except by a spectral revelation. So reasoned the father, so reasoned Judge Samuel Sewall, and so Cotton Mather, to whom Sewall presently turned over this bit of evidence. All of them thereby displayed a certain naivete as to the depth of the ancient lore of sickly young Anne, who had sucked in with her mother's milk uh, all all the slanders of the neighborhood. On September 22, 7 witches and one lone wizard were packed into a cart and hauled a long mile to Gallows Hill. The sheriff had not chosen the most covenant spot of his hangings, but he had chosen a conspicuous one. The hangings were made a spectacle by intention. The Puritans never denied themselves this sort of show. It was considered a sound deterrent to immoral impulses. Yes, let's murder people so we don't have immoral impulses. Especially when the devil was proselytizing the country. Besides, it was always interesting to watch people who could not follow the spectacle at close range on at it spied on it at a distance from their upper windows. From Gallows Hill, the witches in their tune in their turn could take one last look at the distant waters of the bay. Gray today, for the sky was overcast and rain threatening at the brightness of the low runged hills that rolled down to the shore, alight with goldenrod, rich with the smoky blue of the asters, and the first turning of the leaves. For winter was coming, a winter for which they need cut and carry no wood. At a steep ascent to the hill, the cart stuck in the road. The accusers riding close behind plainly saw the devil holding it back. At the gallows, Wardwell tried to access the people of Salem, protesting his innocence, but the waiting sheriff was smoking a pipe by his head, and the smoke blowing into his face choked him off. The girl said that too was the devil's work, though it seemed somewhat inconsistent of him. When it was over, what a sad thing, remarked No Yes, looking up at the oak tree with the heavy fruit, to see 8 fire bands of hell hanging there. There was, had he looked, a sadder sight beside him, the no longer quiet human faces of the afflicted girls. 7 months of careful, cultivated hysteria had not improved these flowers of Puritan maidenhood. They had coarsened and toughened and become nearly as insensible to normal feeling as so many automata. People who shrank from the cruelty of their jest at the dying misjudged them, for they were no more capable of conscious cruelty than of any other really human feeling. The very violence of their apparent emotion disguised as sick inner apathy. Given over so long to the world of dark fantasy, they were no longer capable of response to the electric shock of reality. Almost any of those hanging on the gallows had been happier than they. I mean, what do you expect is going to happen when you do this to people? How miserable they must have been. Marietzi had the love of her children who did not cast her off because she was despised. Martha Coy had beside her honest, blazing moral indignation at the folly of men, the satisfaction of having the last been allowed to pray in public. She had ascended the ladder with an imminent prayer on her lips. All these were happier than the girls. They had pulsated with warm life to the end, and it was doubtful if the girls would ever again know what life was. They were famous, they were powerful. No one in Massachusetts had such power over life and death as they, but they were also alone. They created a little lifeless vacuum about them whenever they moved. Few but their own kin and some of these reluctantly dare come close to them. Uh, they were there were nubile. They were nubile, and some were comely, and yet most youths, barring the likes of John Dotrich, did not willingly come nearer than the yonder side of the road. Than the yonder side of the road. They did not mind, for they lived in a dream, their senses so spellbound that they did not know how bad a dream it was, how stale with repetitions, without the interpolation of fresh air, since they had fallen into it. They went on and on in an old dream, responding to suggestions as um, insensately as a machine responds to the touch of a hand. Though somewhere, though someday some of them might awaken, it now seemed impossible. Mary Warren and Sarah Churchill had already had their brief respites into humanity, and their awakening had been so painful that they had fled thankfully back into joyless fantasy. But their outward state could not last forever. They would not always be imminent. Now, on 22 September 1962, the spell over Massachusetts was lifting. There would not again be a hanging on Gallows Hill for this cause. Thank goodness.